and it is the risk of the $8.6 trillion of household, corporate, and government debt that is quickly accumulating on the shoulders of Canadians.
For his lesson on the economy and on debt and on debt financing, what's quite clear from where the tenet of what he's proposing or certainly saying is that obviously the situation that we're in is untenable from what he's proposing. And that certainly all the investments we made in Canadians in the past year, obviously there was a choice to be made. Us on this side of the House, we decided to invest in Canadians, and he is deriding us for accumulating debt. So I want to know from the member from Carleton, the fact that we've invested too much in Canadians. Obviously, why do we accumulate debt? It was to help Canadians weather this storm, weather the worst pandemic that we all faced as a nation in our lifetime. So I want to know all the programs that this government has brought forward: the CERB, the wage subsidy, the rent subsidy, the mortgage deferral payments, the supporting Indigenous communities, the CEBO loans, the regional relief and recovery fund, the billions of dollars of transfers to the provinces that we provided them to ensure the health and safety of our people, of Canadians. Which one would he have not brought forward?
What would we have done differently? One, we would not have gone into this crisis having already added $100 billion of debt before the very first case of COVID-19. That's the first thing. This government inherited a balanced budget. They blew through $100 billion of debt before COVID-19 even arrived on the scene. When we warned them, the second thing is we would have ensured the COVID crisis would not have spun out of control here in Canada the way it did, because we would have closed the border. We told them, we're on the record of having said that we would close the border. They had military intelligence in December telling them of the risk, and yet they let 60,000 people come from China between December and March into this country, causing the disease to spread quickly. We would have approved rapid testing more quickly so that Canadians could get back into their jobs safely. We would have procured vaccines on a priority basis rather than leaving us at the back of the pack. All of these things would have saved a fortune. And finally, what will we do different going forward? When we come out of the COVID crisis, we would unleash the engine of free market productive economic growth that produces paychecks for people, rather than shutting down the economy by blocking enterprise, as this government has done in project after project. And we reject the government's proposal to make all the COVID spending permanent. They have asked for it in this bill, asked for an increase in the debt limit of another $700 billion. That's irresponsible.
Members, the opportunity.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, for Saskatoon Grasswood, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I, too, present a petition today in the House of Commons, formally recognizing that Uyghurs in China have been and are being subject to genocide. We talked about this earlier in question period, and I want to salute my two members from the Conservative Party that brought this up yesterday in a news conference. All Canadians should be ashamed of this government not standing by Uyghurs in China.
The first is Keystone XL. We are in a jobs crisis, Mr. Speaker. Our economic recovery from COVID-19 depends on vaccines, a plan to get back to work. That requires investments and projects to create jobs in every sector of this country and in every region of this country, Mr. Speaker. In recent days, our country has been dealt a serious blow by the new Biden administration with their executive order canceling the Keystone XL pipeline. Keystone represents a major strategic energy corridor that will enhance North American energy independence away from authoritarian regimes. The project has the potential for tens of thousands of well-paid, unionized jobs both in Canada and the United States. It is time for this government to defend our ethical oil that partners with Indigenous communities to the tune of over $1 billion per year. Keystone was designed with the highest environmental standards to achieve net zero emissions by 2030. Its rejection would actually result in 28 to 42% higher CO2 emissions via rail shipments. We must secure our future. We must secure jobs in every sector and in every region of the country. For the sake of Canada-US relations, our economic recovery, our environment, we need to get Keystone built. We need to get Canadians back to work. The Prime Minister must stand up for Canadian workers and ask the incoming administration to reverse their executive order. This project is in our national interest and will help tens of thousands of families struggling amid this health and economic crisis. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, we respectfully request an emergency debate to drive towards a plan to save this project.
Have pushed Canadian families down, the unraveling of the social safety net, the emphasis on providing perks and tax holidays to the very wealthy and most profitable corporations rather than making the public investments that would make such a difference in the lives of Canadians. And then the pandemic hits. And Canadians are experiencing incredible challenges in my riding of New Westminster Burnaby and in every other corner of this country. Canadians are facing daily challenges to put food on the table, to keep a roof over their head. And yet, within Bill C-14, we don't see any bold attempt to really meet those challenges. And Mr. Speaker, it is indicative, I think, that the new American president, Joe Biden, within the span of his first 5 hours and the executive mandates that he signed, has proven to be more proactive in using government machinery to really work in the interests of the people than this government has in 5 years. 5 hours, 5 years. That is the real disappointment of the current Prime Minister and the current government. So what do we see in C-14? Well, instead of investments in building a national child care program that we know as we emerge hopefully from this pandemic in the next few months, that Canadian families will need that national network of universal child care. Instead of seeing those investments, there is scant support given to Canadian families. In terms of really dealing with the crisis in long-term care, instead of putting it under strict national standards and making sure that there's adequate funding for long-term care for our seniors, we see a small amount compared to what was given to the banking sector, but no real attempt to address the crisis that we're seeing in long-term care. And when we see the $750 billion in liquidity supports provided through a wide variety of federal institutions within days of the pandemic hitting, Mr. Speaker, $750 billion given to the banking sector. Now, government MPs might say, well, this was liquidity supports. It helps the banking sector. Banking sector so far in this pandemic has received profits of $30 billion. That should absolutely not have been the first objective of this government. But contrast that $750 billion with what people with disabilities who are struggling to keep a roof over their head, what they have actually received in supports. The NDP caucus went, and I've mentioned and raised this numerous times, as have other members of the NDP caucus, as has our leader, the member from Burnaby South. We have raised this numerous times, that it took not once or twice, but half a dozen fights to get a $600 payment, one-time payment paid to a minority of people with disabilities across the country. And yet we see, with alacrity, $750 billion going to the banking sector. And we see an interest rate holiday for students when they are struggling to pay for their student loans. Now, during this pandemic, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, the banking sector, $30 billion in profits. Canada's billionaires, over $50 billion in the pandemic added to their wealth. And yet, we see a government that steadfastly refuses to put in place what the member from Burnaby South and the NDP caucus has called for. And the vast majority of Canadians, when they're asked in public opinion, say the same thing, that we need to put in place a wealth tax. We need to put in place a pandemic profits tax. We had those measures in the Second World War. It meant that we were all in this together. And it also meant that the federal government had the wherewithal to ensure that Canadians had the investments they needed as we emerged out of the Second World War. We brought this forward in the House, as you'll recall, Mr. Speaker, along with provisions for guaranteed livable basic income, a right to housing and universal pharmacare, and government members voted against those measures, despite the fact that they are supported by the vast majority of Canadians. Now,
vaccines as they started to arrive for Canadians, and that's exactly what we're doing. We had a strong and aggressive plan to do that, and we're delivering for Canadians.
The Leader of the Opposition.
For Canadians this week, Mr. Speaker. L'approvisionnement européen des vaccins avec...
The European agreement or for delivery of European vaccines with Pfizer and Moderna is raising concerns for Canada. There is vaccine protectionism going on here. And ultimately, there is a price war happening with fierce competition on a global scale. Has this Prime Minister picked up the phone to call European leaders to ensure that our vaccines will be delivered? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Yes, Mr. Speaker. An hour ago, I spoke to Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, to raise our concerns. We are all looking forward to receiving the vaccine doses that we bought under that contract. And I was reassured to hear that the transparency measures taken by Europe will not affect Pfizer and Moderna deliveries to Canada.
Delays in the vaccine mean that more people will get infected and sadly more people will die. Experts have said one of the worst transmissions, one of the biggest transmissions of COVID-19 happen in workplaces. Experts also agree that one of the best tools we have to stop the spread of COVID-19 in workplaces is paid sick leave. So will the Prime Minister commit to making the existing federal program that we fought for broader, easier to access to protect workers and their communities?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we were pleased to bring forward paid sick leave for workers who aren't covered by their workplace. We were happy to have the support of all parties in the House to do just that, and we will continue to work with provinces and territories to ensure that every worker gets the right protection. We have done an awful lot from the federal level and are always looking to do more, but we also know that there are many things that we should be doing in partnership with the provinces, and look forward to continuing to work with willing.
Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, another question on China. A number of entities, including a subcommittee of this House, 2 consecutive U.S. administrations, and Canada's official opposition, have concluded that the government of China is committing a genocide against the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. Yesterday, the minister said the government believes an independent investigation is needed to arrive at that conclusion. Ambassador Ray said something similar before Christmas. So, what specific action has the Government of Canada taken to initiate an independent investigation?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I said yesterday, we are gravely concerned with the very strong allegations that have been made against China with respect to its treatment of the Muslim minority Uyghur people and other minorities. We are calling upon China to allow unfettered access to the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the United Nations, and also to allow an independent, impartial committee of experts to enter China to have an examination of the situation that exists there to confirm or not the situation that's been reported.
Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Mr. Speaker, the all-party subcommittee has already conducted hearings and recognized these crimes as genocide months ago. Now the government's talking about an investigation, but clearly in the absence of any action to make that happen in the meantime, this is simply more obfuscation and delay. The minister knows full well that the same government which lied to the WHO about the spread of COVID-19 is not going to allow unfettered access to members of the International Court of Justice or any other independent investigators. So when will the government put aside the delays and doublespeak and recognize and respond to this genocide?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, we are very concerned with the very compelling reports that have come out that point to the treatment of the Uyghur Muslim minority with respect to forced labor camps and other excesses which do not respect their human rights. And that is why we want to look at this in detail, and we are urging the Chinese government to allow a full, impartial, independent examination by experts of the situation that exists.
Recently, 127 residents at the Roberta Place long-term care home in Barrie tested positive for COVID, and by Sunday afternoon, 40 of them had died. And every day without a vaccine leads to the potential for more outbreaks. The Liberals' delivery of 0 vaccines this week is completely unacceptable. What is the Prime Minister's answer to the people, especially healthcare workers and our beloved seniors who won't get a vaccine this week because of his failure to secure them?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there is an intense competition for vaccines in the world today. In anticipation of this global race, Canada took precautions. We secured the world's most extensive vaccine portfolio from 7 companies with 10 doses for every Canadian. That's why Canada has already vaccinated more people per capita than our G7 peers, Germany, Japan, and France, and more than our Five Eyes partners, Australia and New Zealand. There is no more urgent issue for this government than getting Canadians vaccinated, and together we'll get it done.
The Honourable Member for Portage-Lisker.
Well, we've also just learned that over 335,000 surgeries have been canceled across the country over the last 4 months because of COVID. Life-saving surgeries for things like cancer and heart disease, or procedures to get people out of immense pain and suffering. The overall health cost to Canadians because of these cancellations could be catastrophic. A vaccine is needed now, not maybe, kinda, sorta, in 9 months. Again, why are Canadians getting 0 vaccines this week?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there is no more urgent issue for our government and for Canadians than getting vaccines. That's why over the past few days, the Prime Minister has spoken with the CEOs of Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and Moderna. And let me remind Canadians, 1.1 million vaccines are already here. 6 million doses will arrive in the first quarter, and every Canadian who wants to be vaccinated will be by September.
Member for Portage-Lisker.
Well, if there's one thing we know, it's that Liberals are going to keep misleading Canadians on vaccines. They're refusing to give clear answers on how they're going to fix the vaccine shortage. The vaccine will save lives and bring hope, but we have none arriving in Canada while vaccines go to other countries. People are dying, surgeries are being canceled, and last night, a Liberal MP said the Liberals are banking on vaccines that haven't been approved yet. This is not a game, Mr. Speaker. Lives are at stake. When can Canadians expect to be vaccinated?
Something strange happened in October. The IMF had us growing this year at 5.2%. Now it's 3.6%. That's a massive drop. And the only thing that's happened since then is that the government has released a phantasmic economic statement and a speech from the throne full of crazy ideas to re-engineer our entire economy, even a former Liberal advisor is out saying this government will have spent $1 trillion to achieve nothing for our economy. So once again, with $30 billion of lost GDP and lost paychecks along with it, what does this government expect all those jobless people to do to pay their bills? Are they just expected to put it on the credit card?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our government's priority today is fighting and conquering the coronavirus. We absolutely understand that some provinces and territories, all provinces and territories have...
The testimony that we heard from witnesses today was deeply impactful for me, to the point where, like, I'm sure some of my colleagues on the meeting today, Chair, were likely almost brought to tears. The impact of the pandemic is felt across political stripe, demographic in this country. And I guess, you know, I'm sitting here trying to manage news that the Moderna shipment of vaccines has been deeply cut today. We've got more restrictions on Canadian civil liberties with no end in sight. The EU is looking at trade restrictions on vaccines. I'm actually just trying to manage all this news. And what I don't want to have happen with an interim report is that the government uses that as a way to stall witnesses on vaccine delivery or the ministers in front of committee next week on vaccines. So I don't mind if the analysts want to start writing an interim report, but if this is what this committee is going to do, then they can expect the fact that we are going to be providing recommendations as a committee on vaccine delivery. We're in a national crisis. Like I'm just on a Friday afternoon with no makeup on, trying to absorb the fact that our country is not in a position to be receiving vaccines anytime soon. And what I don't want to have happen is that our health committee, the Federal Standing Committee on Health, in the middle of like essentially a wartime effort when we don't have vaccines, that we might be wasting meetings, deliberating like punctuation on a report that's not material to getting tools that is going to end this pandemic. So if that's the intention of the Liberals on this committee, it is a no-go for me, and it's a no-go for the Conservative Party. I don't mind if analysts want to start writing stuff up, because I do think that the mental health impact of the pandemic is fine. I'm going to look to colleagues, particularly on the NDP end from the bloc, that if we're going to, support a interim report on mental health, that the deliberations on the report would happen outside of the meetings that are scheduled on vaccines for the next couple of weeks, or over the break. If we wanted to deliberate an interim report on mental health, I would suggest that this committee do that over the parliamentary recess, not during the regularly scheduled meetings that are coming up on vaccines. This committee needs to work across political stripe to encourage the government and come up with like bold moonshot positions to get our country vaccines. As I'm sitting here, my phone has just been blowing up today being like, when are we getting vaccines? And me going, I don't know. The government won't say. They say September, but it's not looking great. So that is, like, just bluntly put, that's my concern. I don't think we should be passive aggressive on this. I think, like, if the Liberals want us to be taking meetings away from a vaccine study, I do not support that. There will be no improvement in mental health of Canadians unless we get vaccines, rapid tests, therapeutics, and variant testing capacity to every Canadian. So I'm not sure if any of the rest of my colleagues have this opinion. I would like to hear it, but I do not want to take committee business or meetings away to be looking at punctuation on a report when we need to be getting vaccines to Canadians.
Thank you, Ms. Rempel-Garner. We go now to Mr. Barlow. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Rempel said much of what I was going to say is, I understand Mr. Van Bynen's motion here and what he's trying to achieve, but I don't think that this report should, if the analysts have the time and they are able to manage that and they want to work on that in their own time, I can understand that, but that motion or that report should not in any way interfere with the ongoing study of this committee into what is now going into vaccines. We've heard from the witnesses as part of the mental health study that one of the root causes of people's stress and mental health anxiety right now is, not knowing when access to vaccines is going to be happening. No home-based and rapid testing. If we really want to address people's mental health, we have to give them some answers. And those answers right now, the most critical thing is vaccines and where are they and what is going to be the distribution plan. So again, I have nothing against Mr. Van Bynen's motion as long as that study in no way impedes on what this committee is going to be doing next into vaccines. And Mr. Davies may have a further point in the fact that the NDP's priority is going to come up after the vaccine study. So he may see that as equally as important as the Conservative members on this committee feel on the vaccine. But I agree in that mental health, the impact on mental health as a result of COVID is immense and profound. We've all heard that from our witnesses. We've seen the statistics that have been released. We saw the suicide numbers from across Canada as a result of an order paper question released yesterday. And Alberta, in my province, was the highest, second highest in the country behind Ontario. So we understand the impact this is having. But the root cause, the number one priority with Canadians that I think all of us are hearing right now is vaccines. Where are they? And unfortunately, the news just keeps getting worse and worse and worse every day where,